What's up, designers? Welcome back to the studio. In this tutorial, I'm going to pick up with the actual process of running the stringers. And to do that, I'm going to do a little bit of prep with our ribs. So in the design so far, we've carefully mapped out the location of each one of our stringer notches. We used the abrasive notching tool to sort of cut those notches in place. And now this is going to get a little bit strange, right, and divergent. If depending on whether you guys designed your ribs to look a little bit like mine, or maybe you designed your ribs to sort of work in the round, the next few steps are going to be different depending on how you chose to design your ribs and stringer piece. If your ribs have a flat edge on them, we're going to need to sort of build ourselves a rigid, sort of a temporary rigid spine, so that as we are assembling and gluing up our piece, it has something to sort of keep it into position. If you designed your pieces in the round, like this first piece I showed you, you're going to have a slightly different process. In all the processes, though, we'll use these blue rubber bands as sort of temporary clamps to hold the wood in place, to kind of hold it in its notches while the PVA glue sets. What I'm going to do today is demonstrate how to build one of these sort of cardboard splines, how I'm going to use it to sort of arrange my 3 ribs in this sort of canoe or kayak shape here, with 1 large rib in the middle and then 2 small end ribs. Before I get into that, I'll just say too that if you're making large transitions, say from a big rib to a small rib, you got to keep in mind that the number of notches needs to stay the same. We're going to run the same number of stringers over both the big ribs and the small ribs. That means on the large ribs, your stringers will be spaced a little bit farther apart, and on the small ribs, your stringers will get close together. Now this gets really complicated when you're stepping down to very, very small ribs. If you found that as you were doing your notching with the abrasive cutting tool, if your ribs were just getting too close together and you're just kind of making paper mush out of the edge, then back your ribs up a little bit away from the sort of pointy end of your form and make a little bit larger rib here, right? I could definitely have sort of made my life more simple had I used a little bit larger rib on either end. For starters, I need to design myself this rigid back to the support system. Now, I used 2 layers of cardboard. I made some double corrugate, and in your kits, you guys have some sheets of this cardboard stock. It's single corrugate, which basically means it's just 1 zigzagging layer. My suggestion would be that, because single corrugate cardboard is pretty flexible, to laminate 2 pieces of cardboard together, use a little bit of PVA glue and press those in between. That's going to make a much more rigid cardboard spine for the back of your pieces. The rubber bands aren't going to squeeze that hard, but as you're kind of attaching this whole thing together, you'd hate for your spine to accidentally start to drift. Essentially, what we're designing is the stiff, sort of rigid back or rigid plane that I have here on my side view. Now, I just happen to have a scrap of double corrugate cardboard sitting around the studio that saves me the hassle of having to laminate today. This is pretty rigid just by itself, so I'm going to cut a strip of this off that is the width of one of my skinnier ribs. Double corrugate cardboard cuts with about the same sort of technique as foam core does. Double corrugate or single corrugate cardboard is a piece of paper plus corrugate plus a piece of paper plus more corrugate plus a piece of paper. I'll cut through each one of those steps individually. From here, I need to sort of establish the sort of size, the center marks, and the top and bottom. That should be easy enough to just reference directly on my drawing. I'll bring my spine over and mark my center line. This will be where my center rib sits, and if I'm ready to attach that one, what I'll do is use a little bit of this low tack blue painter's tape, and I need a piece on either side of my rib. And I'm going to put a hard crease in the tape so that it sticks down and holds it as vertically as possible. And if you have a piece where symmetry really matters and the sort of spacing really matters, take your time here to really get it to look right. Get it centered on the spline this way. Make sure it's not wonky left to right. And then give that blue painter's tape a couple of hard presses. From here, I'll mark my top and bottom, or what I'll call my anchor ribs. Now the distance here is really determined by how long my stringers are. We cut all of our stringers down to about an 8-inch stringer. Make sure that you're either measuring or that your drawing is to scale, so that when you lay in these lines, you don't space them too far apart. It's okay to have a little bit of overhang with your stringers, but you shouldn't make them too short. Eventually, if you have a little bit of overhang in when you do your final glue ups, we'll be nipping these little bits off here so that we end in a nice hard edge. If down the road you would like to then take that flat edge and build it up a little bit so that you have sort of a more finished, either for my canoe design, either I could add the sort of point, or for this design that I made, I sort of stacked up some laminates of foam core and sanded it back to sort of give it a rounded finish. That really depends on your drawing and on your design. This rigid frame is going to help sort of align your work so that it keeps everything leveled. If you have the flat-edged ribs, this way my side view is going to include that camber so that my stringers bend down to either end of my design, and it's also going to keep me in line going straight here, because once I start to add the stringers, it wants to twist and pull around quite a bit. With a bit of fidgeting, I've been able to lay in my rubber bands as anchors that are going to hold on either one of my anchor ribs. I may be able to get away in my design with only having 2 rubber bands. We'll kind of see how this goes. Now I'm going to start to slip some stringers into my design here, and anchor one on one end and the other on the other end. Once I start to get more stringers in place, the whole design will start to hold itself together better. Notice how I have overhanging stringer on either end. That's okay. I'll need more stringer here as the design gets wider, and I'm still more or less basically in line here. I think I'm going to avoid leaving a rubber band on this middle section because the tension of the stringer is going to hold it in place. This is partly so that you guys can get a sense of how your design is going to lay out, but more importantly, it's going to hold these joints in place as they're gluing. Eventually, once you get a few of your stringers laid in, you'll be able to put a dab of glue inside each one of these joints and let the rubber bands hold those stringers in place. The small amount of tension that the rubber band clamps put on your piece is just enough for that PVA glue to set. Once it's set, probably a half an hour to an hour later, you can remove all the rubber bands, or remove the cardboard stringer, remove the cardboard spline here, and you'll have a piece that's ready for finishing. I'll add 1 or 2 more stringers here before I call it a night in the studio, but I'm excited to see how you guys are going to choose to approach this rubber banding technique. Whether you're working in the round or whether you're working with a flat, it's delicate work. So be patient with yourself and find a way to mock it all up first, or what we'll call a dry fit. before you add any glue to this thing, let's see if we can get it all to hold together. I'll catch up with you guys in the studio.